A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Corn, I was looking at the latest satellite imagery coming out of the Natanz enrichment facility this morning, and it really puts a perspective on where we are in this conflict. We are officially entering the fourth week of Operation Rising Lion, and the level of precision we are seeing is unlike anything in the last 2 decades. It is not just about the destruction, it is about the specific surgical nature of the targets.
It is remarkable, Herman. I am Corn Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. The data coming out of the Pentagon and the Israeli Defense Forces indicates we have surpassed 15,000 targets struck since the start of hostilities on February 28, 2026. Today's prompt from Daniel is about this specific moment in the war. He is asking us to analyze the senior Israeli intelligence claim that the primary military goals could be achieved within the next 2 to 3 weeks, specifically through a strategy of regime degradation rather than a full-scale ground invasion.
It is a bold claim, especially when you consider the scale of the Iranian defensive network. Daniel is pointing us toward this hybrid theory of change. The idea is that the coalition forces provide the external kinetic pressure, basically breaking the regime's back, and then the Iranian people themselves step in to finish the job. It avoids the quagmire of a long-term occupation, but relies heavily on the internal breaking point of the Iranian state. We are essentially watching a high-stakes gamble on the limits of a nation-state's endurance.
The math on this is actually quite specific, and it is what the IDF is banking on. As of yesterday, March 21st, 77% of the 107 identified Iranian underground tunnel entrances have been destroyed. That is a massive blow to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps infrastructure. When Brigadier General Effie Defrin says they need 3 more weeks, he is looking at the remaining 23% of those strategic nodes. The goal here is strategic isolation, cutting off the head from the body.
But that is the part that always gets messy, right? We have seen this movie before where we think a few weeks of airstrikes will cause a collapse, and then months later we are still waiting for the uprising. Daniel wants us to look at the historical precedents for this. Is there actually a pattern where external military degradation successfully catalyzes an endogenous overthrow? Or are we just hoping for a convenient exit strategy? We have to define what hybrid actually means in this context. It is not just regime change from the outside, it is regime collapse from within, triggered by an outside force.
To understand this, we have to look at the current leadership transition in Tehran. Mojtaba Khamenei assumed power following the reported death of his father, Ali Khamenei, very early in this conflict. That is a moment of extreme structural fragility. Any autocracy is at its weakest during a succession, especially one happening under a reign of bunker busters. If the central authority cannot tell its local enforcers who to shoot or where to go because the communication nodes are gone, the regime effectively evaporates, even if the leaders are still sitting in a bunker in Tehran.
I suppose that brings us to the first major historical precedent Daniel is likely thinking of, which is Iraq in 1991. Operation Desert Storm was a masterclass in degrading a military. We destroyed the Iraqi Air Force, their command structure, and their heavy armor in a matter of weeks. And what happened? The people did rise up. The 1991 Intifada saw 14 of 18 provinces fall out of Saddam Hussein's control almost immediately. It was the hybrid moment before we had a name for it.
And that is the cautionary tale, Herman. The reason the Iraqi regime survived in 1991 was because the coalition stopped the degradation just short of the finish line. We allowed the regime to keep their helicopter gunships, which they used to slaughter the rebels. The hybrid model being proposed today by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Forces seems to be a direct response to that failure. They are not just hitting tanks. They are hitting the very tools of domestic repression. They are targeting the passenger communication hubs and the internal security headquarters.
It is interesting you mentioned that because the casualty gap in Operation Rising Lion is staggering and speaks to that technical degradation. We are looking at over 1,500 Iranian fatalities versus only about 15 Israeli fatalities. That kind of lopsided exchange has a massive psychological effect on the rank-and-file security forces. If you are a besiege officer and you see that 92% of your ballistic missiles are being intercepted by Arrow and Patriot systems, you start to realize the regime's primary source of power, its perceived invincibility, is a myth.
The interception rate is a huge technical factor. Out of more than 400 ballistic missiles fired by Iran since February 28th, almost none have hit high-value targets. When the regime cannot protect its own headquarters, like the Guard Corps Navy headquarters in Tehran that was hit last week, the internal logic of the state begins to fray. This leads us to another precedent, which is Serbia in 1999. Operation Allied Force.
78 days of bombing, right? That was a long time to wait for a quick collapse.
It was, but it is a fascinating example because Slobodan Milosevic did not fall the day the bombing stopped. But the degradation of his economic and military power base was so thorough that he can no longer maintain the patronage networks that kept him in power. It created the structural conditions for the bulldozer revolution a year later. The Israeli strategy right now seems to be trying to compress that timeline from a year down to a few weeks by targeting the leadership transition of Mojtaba Khamenei directly. They are trying to induce what political scientists call endogenous political failure.
You are talking about using kinetic force to create a vacuum, but for this to work you need someone to fill that vacuum. In the Serbia case, there was an organized opposition. In the current conflict, we see groups like the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or the NCRI, positioning themselves as that force. The question is whether they have the ground-level support to take over the local administration once the Guard Corps loses its ability to communicate. If you killed a parasite but the host is too weak to stand, you just end up with a dead host.
That brings us to the third precedent, Libya in 2011. That was perhaps the purest version of the hybrid model we have seen. NATO provided the air power to degrade Gaddafi's heavy weaponry, and the National Transitional Council provided the boots on the ground. It worked in terms of removing the regime without a Western ground invasion. But, as we know, the aftermath was a disaster because the internal institutions were non-existent.
Right, and that is where I want to push back on the optimism a bit, Korn. While the military math looks great on paper, the 15,000 targets, the 77% tunnel destruction, the political reality is starting to show some daylight between the United States and Israel. President Trump has been very clear that he wants to wind this down. He authorized the campaign, but he just gave that 48-hour ultimatum regarding the Strait of Hormuz.
That friction is the primary risk to the hybrid strategy. If the Iranians reopen the strait, Trump might be inclined to take the win and stop the strikes, whereas Netanyahu clearly wants those full 3 weeks to ensure the regime actually collapses. If the coalition stops the degradation at 60% or 70%, you end up with a wounded but still functional regime, much like Iraq in 1991. The 48-hour window is a massive strategic pivot. If the United States pulls back its carrier groups or stops providing the logistics for the heavy strikes, the momentum for an internal uprising could stall.
And then there is the humanitarian cost, which becomes a strategic liability in this hybrid model. The strike on the Tehran school on March 7th is a perfect example. Even if it was a technical error, as the Pentagon is investigating, it complicates the liberator narrative. You cannot easily tell a population to rise up and join you if they are mourning 175 children killed in a school strike. It gives Mojtaba Khamenei a propaganda lifeline to rally nationalist sentiment against the foreign invaders.
It does, though the internal intelligence report suggests the Iranian public is increasingly placing the blame on the regime for provoking the conflict in the first place. This is where the technical threshold for a state to lose its monopoly on violence comes in. In a place like Iran, that relies heavily on the Basij being able to mobilize and suppress protests in cities like Mashhad and Isfahan, If we have destroyed 77% of the tunnel entrances and targeted the C2 nodes, that is command and control, what does that actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon in downtown Tehran?
It looks like a breakdown in the chain of command. If a local commander is facing a crowd of 10,000 protesters and he cannot get a clear order from his superiors, or if he knows that his superiors have no way to reinforce him because the transport hubs are interdicted, he is much more likely to stand down or defect. We saw this in the early days of the Arab Spring. The military only fires on the people as long as they believe the regime is going to win. Once the 92% interception rate and the 15,000 targets hit home, that belief evaporates.
So the 3-week window is really about psychology as much as it is about physics. It is about convincing the middle management of the Iranian state that the current leadership is a sinking ship. But that brings us back to the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran carries out its threat to completely close the strait, the economic pressure on the West might force a ceasefire before that psychological tipping point is reached. This is why the US-Israel coalition is prioritizing the Iranian Navy headquarters and their anti-ship missile sites. They have to keep the strait open to buy the time necessary for the degradation to work.
I think it is also worth noting the role of the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir. He has been very vocal about this being a strategy of strategic isolation. He is not talking about marching on Tehran. He is talking about making Tehran irrelevant to the rest of the country. If you can isolate the capital from the provinces, you do not need to fight a battle for every street. You just let the center collapse under its own weight. It is a very surgical approach to degradation. They are trying to kill the parasite without killing the host.
But can you actually calibrate the collapse of a nation-state? That is the question. The Serbia 1999 model is instructive here because the bombing did not just hit military targets. It hit the power grid and the bridges. It made it impossible for Milosevic to govern. In Iran, the strikes on the power plants are the ultimate escalation. The White House has used that as a red line, but the Israelis see it as the final lever. If the lights go out in Tehran and stay out, the regime's ability to monitor its own people via the internet and surveillance cameras vanishes.
And that is the moment the NCRI and other opposition groups have been waiting for. But we have to be realistic. A power vacuum in a country as large and complex as Iran is a terrifying prospect for the region. Even with our pro-Israel and pro-American perspective, you have to wonder if the transition can be managed. If you degrade the regime to the point of collapse, who prevents the various factions from turning on each other? Libya showed us that removing the top layer is the easy part. Building the next layer is where the hybrid model usually fails.
The difference, according to proponents of this strategy, is the level of institutionalization. Iran has a deep state that exists outside of the religious leadership. The goal of the current strikes on Malik Ashtar University and the R&D sites is to decapitate the technical leadership of the weapons programs while leaving the broader infrastructure of the country intact. It is a gamble on human agency. We provide the bunker busters. They provide the courage.
It is certainly a more efficient way to conduct the conflict if it works. But the next 21 days are going to be some of the most consequential in modern Middle Eastern history. If the Israeli intelligence is right, we are looking at the end of a 47-year era. If they are wrong, we are looking at a regional war that could drag on for years.
We should look at some practical takeaways for listeners who are watching the news this week. There are a few key indicators that will tell us if this regime degradation strategy is actually succeeding. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz. If it stays open despite the Iranian threats, it means the coalition has successfully neutralized the regime's primary counteroffensive capability. That is the first domino.
Second, look for reports of defections within the regular Iranian army or the lower ranks of the Basij. Large-scale kinetic strikes are designed to create these fissures. If you start seeing units refusing to engage with protesters in cities like Isfahan, that is the signal that the monopoly on violence has been broken. That is the technical threshold Korn mentioned earlier.
And third, monitor the communication coming out of Mojtaba Khamenei's office. If the regime starts making desperate diplomatic overtures through third parties, or if their rhetoric shifts from defiance to survival, it means the degradation of their command and control infrastructure is hitting home. They are losing their grip on the narrative and the state.
I would add one more: keep an eye on the daylight between Washington and Jerusalem. If President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu can stay aligned on the 3-week window, the pressure will be relentless. If the 48-hour ultimatum leads to a premature halt, the regime might find the breathing room it needs to survive the storm. It is a very delicate diplomatic dance happening alongside the air campaign. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are reportedly exploring peace talks, which could either be a way to facilitate a surrender or a way for the regime to stall for time.
It really is a high-stakes experiment in 21st century warfare. No ground invasion, no long-term occupation, just maximum pressure and a hope for a better future, led by the people on the ground. It is military force used as a political catalyst. We saw it work in Serbia, we saw it partially work in Libya, and we saw what happens when you stop too early in Iraq. The coalition seems determined not to repeat the mistakes of 1991.
It is a lot to process. If you are following this closely, I highly recommend going back to episode 957 where we talked about the shadow mechanics of regime change. It provides a lot of the foundational theory that underpins what we are seeing today regarding how subversion and external pressure interact. And if you want the earlier context on this specific conflict, episode 890 on Operation Roaring Lion covers the initial planning stages that led us to this February 28th launch.
This has been my Weird Prompts. A huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show.
If you are finding these deep dives helpful, the best thing you can do is leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation about these complex global shifts.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the feed.
We will be back soon to see how that 3-week window is holding up and whether the hybrid model delivers on its promise. Until then, keep an eye on the headlines and stay curious.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth